The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus said, "My sheep hear my voice. I know them and they follow me. I give them eternal life and they shall never perish. No one can take them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one can take them out of the Father's hand. The Father and I are one." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
This Sunday is the National Day of Vocations to the Priesthood and Religious Life here in the United States. It always falls on Good Shepherd Sunday, usually the fourth Sunday of Easter, when the readings come from chapter 10 of John's Gospel, one of the sayings of Jesus as being the Good Shepherd of his sheep. And so this is the National Day of Vocations to Priesthood and Religious Life. It falls on Good Shepherd Sunday because there's always that gospel, the idea that Jesus calls, and he calls his sheep to follow him. Some are called, some among us are called to follow Christ in the priesthood or in the religious life. A vocation, any kind of vocation, is always understood as a calling from God. The idea, as Jesus says, that my sheep hear my voice and they follow me. So there's two ideas in there. Especially true for thinking about vocations to the priesthood, a calling to the priesthood of religious life that you may sense maybe in a son and a grandson and a nephew, someone in your family. And so for those of us who have discerned the vocation to the priesthood, there's always that first step of hearing the voice of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. And that looks like, or maybe feels like, a certain kind of interior tug at your heart, something calling you to another way of life, different from a secular job in a secular world. Could be a call to holiness. That was the call I had. It was strong for me, although the call to holiness and achieving it are two different things, and for me at least they are. There's also that call to service of others, that I don't want to just spend my life on myself, but I want to spend my life in service to others. Maybe a call to a more radical lifestyle, something countercultural, something different. There's a call to be devoted to maybe more prayer in one's life, or have more time for reflection or contemplation. Maybe that interior tug or that call to a job or a career that talks about the gospel and spreads God's word. And some feel a call towards carrying the gospel to other people in other parts of the world. And that's kind of what it feels like to hear the voice of Jesus calling one to the priesthood or religious life. So how do you hear that voice? How do you know it's the voice of Jesus? Well, I think, like I first mentioned, first of all, you do feel that kind of a tug. There's something in your heart, some kind of openness or interest or curiosity in that kind of lifestyle. Also, I think that's reinforced because other people may have noticed that in you. And that helps to reinforce the voice of Jesus and clarifies God's call as well. And for me, this is one of the key aspects, was hearing other people who called me to the seminary, to go into the seminary in the priesthood, because I was waiting for a voice from the heavens or a letter from God. It was never quite that clear. It was never ever that clear at all, but it came much more through the voices of other people. And so you may be the ones who are the voices of God, the instruments of God, in calling others to follow Jesus as a priest or in the religious life, especially for members of your family. And so there's the idea that the voice of the Good Shepherd comes through other people. And that's nurtured with one's prayer and reflection. I'm kind of thinking about, is this Jesus calling me? What should I be doing with my life? And it can be hard to hear the voice of Jesus if you completely immerse yourself in the world and its values. Even though the world's not bad and all the values of the world aren't bad either, still, there are voices, in a sense, in the world, in the secular world, calling one to wealth, calling one to focus on oneself, maybe calling people away from religion. It's hard to hear the voice of the Good Shepherd clearly and discern that voice if we're completely immersed in the world. That's why the seminary is a good place to discern that vocation to the priesthood. And then finally, I think to hear the voice of the Good Shepherd calling one to the priesthood, I don't think that's very uncommon. An uncommon experience for any of us to hear the voice of the Good Shepherd, because God tempts us to do a lot of good things in our lives. You know what it's like to be called or to be tempted to prayer, right? You feel, I need to pray right now for some reason. You've been tempted to give alms, to be generous to the poor when someone asks you for a handout. You've been tempted to forgive people. You've been tempted to come to Mass, so you know a little bit what that tug is like. Whether you give into it or not is a whole other question, but you know what it's like to have an intimation of the voice of the Good Shepherd in your own life, and you may be able to see that in your son or your grandson or a nephew. And so having heard the voice of Jesus, the next thing that happens is following Jesus. Because it's one thing to hear the voice, it's another thing to follow, to act upon the voice of Jesus and his call, especially to the priesthood. I think that actually there are many men who hear the voice of Jesus, but they don't follow him to the priesthood for whatever reason. For me, I know I heard the voice of Jesus through other people very strongly at one Bible study I was attending with a Christian group in my first year of college. And that was when I finally decided I needed to do something about this. I needed to make a phone call, called my parents and told them what my plans were. I called the priest vocation director, went to a come and see retreat in the seminary. So it took a while, it took a few years in the sense of hearing God calling me through other people before I finally acted upon it. But it was a good first step to take. It's one thing to be tempted to something good, it's another to act on it, to hear the voice of the Good Shepherd and then to follow him. It's a struggle to discern a call to the priesthood and then to accept it and embrace it. Because it means saying no to some good things, marriage, family, job, sexual relationship, bringing the gospel to a secular job, being immersed in that life, carrying the good news to your workplace. Those are all good things. And going into the priesthood means saying no to some of those good things in order to say yes to many other good things. Service of God's people, more time for prayer, pastoring different communities, dedication to the mission of Jesus and his church, things like that. It's a matter of saying no to some things so I can say yes to others, saying goodbye to some things so I can say hello to other things in life. A couple of weeks ago, I was on a retreat the week after Easter, along with a friend of mine who's a priest pastor in Los Angeles, in the Archdiocese. And we were in the seminary together for 4 years. My last 4 years, his 4 out of 5. And so he was telling me, he asked me, so how did you finally know, when did you know that you wanted to be a priest when you were going to do it? Because we were always debating, do I get married or am I going to be a priest, right? Always those two good choices. I said, well, when I finally decided, it was about 3 minutes before I wrote the letter to the bishop saying, please ordain me. After 7 years of seminary, you go back and forth, you waver, go back and forth. At some point, you got to make a decision. And so for him, he said he was sharing, his was kind of the same struggle, not sure exactly what to do. And he said that he'd always had in mind the picture of his wife and his children and his family. And that was something that he was discerning along with the call to the priesthood, should he get married or not. He was telling me the story that his last year at the seminary, his spiritual director gave him a spiritual exercise to do. It was kind of to envision his life as a married man and what that would be like. And he said that as he went to prayer, he envisioned himself and with his bride, with his wife, at the foot of the altar, and he looked up and there was no priest there to receive the vows between him and his wife because no one had said yes to the priesthood. And he said he had in mind a picture, he's carrying his baby daughter in his arms on the day of her baptism, at the baptismal font, standing there with his wife, and yet there was no priest there to baptize his baby daughter because no one had said yes to the priesthood. And he was saying, as tears are coming down his face, he was saying he saw the day of his daughter's wedding, and he was standing in the back of the church ready to walk his daughter down the aisle on the day of her wedding. And he looked up, and he got the sense, a kind of a call from God saying, you're supposed to be at the other end of the aisle by the altar, to receive the young woman's vows and not to give her away. And so he had to mourn the loss of what would never be in his life so that he could say yes to the priesthood. And it wasn't, he has no regrets, no resentments in life, very happy as a priest, would never go back and do it another way. But he had to say goodbye to something, to say hello to something else. He had to say, no, I can't do that, in order to say yes to the vocation to the priesthood. Always that discernment process, hearing the voice of the Good Shepherd and following him. So I'd say for those who have parents and grandparents, those who have nephews, I think you want your child, you want your son to be happy, and I'm sure you pray for his future career. you have a very important role to play in hearing the voice of Jesus, maybe calling your son, your grandson, your nephew to the priesthood, and encouraging him to follow the call of Jesus. Not just hear that voice and stop it, but also to encourage him to follow that voice, at least to discern it. Priesthood incorporates everything of the best that you want for your son, at least ideally, right? You want your son to be holy, you want him to be smart, you want him to be a good person, you want him to be loved and loving, you want him to be kind, you want him to be a good leader. And certainly not all priests are like that, but again, ideally, that's where you want priests to be, and that's what you would want for your son, no matter what career he chooses, no matter what vocation in life he chooses. And so you have an important role in encouraging your son to discern the voice of Jesus in his life and to follow that call as well. So that you don't let your fears, don't let your good, happy marriage, don't let your desire for grandchildren get in the way of the voice of Jesus, who might be calling him to the priesthood. You have an important role to play in helping to discern that call. As Jesus says in the gospel, his sheep hear his voice, all of his sheep, not just those called to the priesthood. All of us hear the voice of Jesus. We feel that tug in our heart to do good from time to time. It's a matter for us then to not just hear the voice of Jesus, but to follow him in all things.